Say the name out loud.
Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, the German goldsmith, the movable type, the printing press, 1450 more or less, the invention that made the modern world. It is one of the most confidently told stories in Western history, the kind of story that gets taught in schools without footnotes, without qualifications, without the uncomfortable appendix that says, actually, it's more complicated than that. And it is more complicated than that. Not because Gutenberg didn't build something remarkable, he did. The press he developed in Mainz in the 1440s and 1450s was a genuine engineering achievement. And the book it produced, the Bible, printed in 2 volumes around 1455, is one of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. But Gutenberg was not the first person to invent movable type. Not by 4 centuries. And the story of how the printing press actually changed the world, how it moved from Gutenberg's workshop to every corner of Europe, how it triggered a religious revolution, how it destroyed the information monopoly of the church, how it helped end the Middle Ages and begin the modern era. That story is far stranger, far more violent, and far more human than the version most people know. The story of the printing press is ultimately a story about what happens when an idea becomes impossible to contain.
And you cannot fully understand that story
Without starting, as you always must, at the beginning, which is not Germany, which is not even Europe. To understand what the printing press changed, you have to understand what the world looked like before it. In Europe, in the year 1400, almost no one could read. This is not quite the same as saying almost no one was literate, though that was also largely true. It is a slightly different observation. Books existed. They had always existed since the ancient world, but they were made by hand, each one copied, letter by letter, word by word, page by page, by a trained scribe in a scriptorium, typically attached to a monastery. A single Bible might take a monk more than a year to copy. A complete library of 100 books represented decades of collective labor. Books were, therefore, extraordinarily expensive. A single volume might cost as much as a farm. Universities and great cathedrals owned books, sometimes chained to their reading stands so they could not be removed. Wealthy nobles owned books as status symbols. The idea that a tradesman, or a farmer, or a woman of any class might personally own a book, might read one in the privacy of their own home, might access the written words of scholars or theologians or historians without the mediation of a priest or a teacher, this was simply not part of the world as it existed. Knowledge moved slowly. Knowledge moved through people, through teachers, through preachers, through travelers who had memorized what they heard and repeated it elsewhere. The written word was real, but it was rare, and its rarity meant it was controlled. The church understood this. The monopoly on literacy, and therefore on the interpretation of sacred texts, was not an accident. It was an architecture of power. The priest read the Bible. The congregation heard what the priest chose to say about it. The gap between the text and the listener was managed, curated, controlled. This is the world the printing press destroyed. Not quickly, not cleanly, not without violence, but it destroyed it. In approximately 1040 AD, 400 years before Johannes Gutenberg was born, a Chinese artisan and inventor named Bi Sheng developed a process for printing using individual movable characters. He carved individual Chinese characters onto small blocks of hardened clay, baked them until they were hard, and arranged them in an iron frame filled with a resin mixture. When the frame was heated, the resin softened, and the characters could be pressed tightly together. When it cooled, the characters were locked in place, forming a printing surface. After printing, The frame was reheated, the characters released, and they could be rearranged to compose the next page.
This is movable type.
This is in principle the same concept that Gutenberg would develop 4 centuries later. Bi Sheng's invention was recorded by the Chinese polymath Shen Kuo in his book Dream Pool Essays, written in 1088, a remarkable document that describes dozens of scientific and technological observations of the Song Dynasty era. Shen Kuo had actually known Bi Sheng and had inherited some of his clay-type pieces after the inventor's death. So why didn't Chinese movable type change the world in the way Gutenberg's press did? The answer is not simple, and it is important not to oversimplify it. Several factors combined. The Chinese writing system has tens of thousands of characters. A complete set of movable type for Chinese requires an enormous number of individual pieces, far more than the 26 letters of a European alphabet. This made the process of composing a page slower and more complex than in an alphabetic system. For many types of Chinese printing, traditional carved wooden blocks, which allowed an entire page to be carved at once, remained faster and more practical.
Later Chinese inventors
Improved on Bi Sheng's design. Wang Zhen, in 1298, developed a more practical system using wooden type pieces arranged in revolving tables so that compositors could find characters quickly. He printed a local gazette and a technical manual and described the process in detail. The technology existed and worked. But the combination of factors, the complexity of the writing system, the existing excellence of block printing, the different social and religious structure of Chinese society, meant that Chinese movable type did not trigger the same cascade of consequences that Gutenberg's press would trigger in Europe. And then there is Korea. In the early 13th century, the Korean government began developing bronze movable type, metal, not clay or wood, for government printing. By 1234, metal movable type was in use in Korea, 200 years before Gutenberg. The Goryeo dynasty printed Buddhist texts and official documents using metal type. This matters because the invention of metal movable type in Europe, the specific technical innovation that made Gutenberg's press viable at scale, was not, as is sometimes implied, a European discovery. It was a Korean one. Whether Gutenberg knew about East Asian printing technology, whether there was any transmission of knowledge along trade routes, is disputed and probably unknowable. What is not disputed is that the technology existed in Korea for centuries before it existed in Europe.
The history of the printing press
Begins, as so many histories do, not in the place most famous for it. Johannes Gutenberg was born in Mainz, Germany, probably around 1400. He was the son of a patrician family, well-connected, reasonably prosperous, with experience in metalworking through the family's association with the ecclesiastical mint in Mainz. Almost nothing is known about his early life. He disappears from the historical record for several years in his 20s and 30s, reappearing in Strasbourg in the 1430s, where he was apparently working on a secret project. We know it was secret because Gutenberg himself made it secret. The surviving records of the period include legal documents from lawsuits, one in 1439 brought against Gutenberg by the heirs of a deceased business partner. And these documents reveal that Gutenberg had formed a private partnership with several investors to develop some kind of machine involving presses, type, lead, and a special ink. He was protecting the idea. He understood its value, and he understood that if others knew what he was developing, they might replicate it before he could profit from it. What exactly he was developing at this stage and how close it was to the final press is uncertain. What is clear is that by the time he returned to Mainz in the early 1440s, He had spent years refining a system that combined several existing technologies in a new way. The screw press, used for wine and olive oil for centuries, adapted to apply even pressure to a printing surface. Oil-based ink, different from the water-based inks used in earlier printing and formulated to adhere properly to metal. And most importantly, individually cast metal type. Each letter of the Latin alphabet cast separately in a metal alloy, lead, tin, and antimony, in a device Gutenberg designed called a type mold, which allowed the same letter to be cast identically, repeatedly, in unlimited quantities. This last element was the essential breakthrough. Not the press itself, screw presses were common. Not the ink, ink was old. Not even movable type in principle. That principle was 4 centuries old. What Gutenberg invented was a system for mass-producing individual metal-type pieces of identical dimensions so that they could be assembled into lines, locked into a frame, and produce a printed page where every letter was sharp, uniform, and legible.
The key word is system.
Gutenberg did not invent printing, he industrialized it. By around 1450, Gutenberg was back in Mainz and working with a new financial backer, a wealthy businessman named Johann Fust. The partnership was substantial. Fust provided the equivalent of several thousand gold coins over multiple years, secured against Gutenberg's equipment. The project they funded was the most ambitious printing undertaking in European history. A Bible. Not a small text, not a pamphlet, not a document. A complete Latin Bible, the Vulgate, in 2 volumes, printed in double columns with 42 lines per column. The type was designed to resemble the finest hand-lettered manuscripts of the era, so perfect that a reader unfamiliar with printing might not immediately recognize it as machine-made.
The Gutenberg Bible,
also known as the 42-line Bible, took several years to produce. The exact number of copies printed is not known, but estimates suggest somewhere between 160 and 180 copies, of which approximately 49 survive today in various conditions. When it was complete, it was extraordinary. A delegate from the Pope, who saw copies in Frankfurt in 1455, wrote to a correspondent that the type was so clear and so precise that one could read it without effort and without spectacles. He was astonished. He had presumably never seen a printed book before, and the regularity of the type, each letter identical to every other instance of itself, the lines perfectly aligned, the spacing consistent, was unlike anything a manuscript could achieve. The Gutenberg Bible is, by universal agreement among those who have seen one, among the most beautiful books ever made. Not a rough prototype, not an experiment, but a finished masterpiece. The first major book ever printed in Europe, produced at a level of quality that subsequent printers spent centuries trying to match. And yet, Gutenberg never saw it completed. Not really, not as a success. In 1455, the same year the Bible was likely being completed or recently completed, Johann Fust sued Johannes Gutenberg.
the lawsuit
Was over the loans Fust had made. Fust claimed that Gutenberg had not used the money properly and demanded repayment with compound interest. The total claimed was enormous, far more than Gutenberg could pay. Gutenberg lost. The court ruled in Fust's favor. As settlement, Gutenberg was forced to hand over the press, the type, and the tools, essentially everything he had built. Fust took the equipment and, with Gutenberg's former assistant Peter Schoeffer, who had become Fust's son-in-law, established his own printing house. It was Fust and Schoeffer who sold and distributed the Gutenberg Bible. It was Fust and Schoeffer who collected the profits. Gutenberg was left with almost nothing. The details of what happened next in Gutenberg's life are unclear. He appears to have continued some printing work with a smaller, separate press he may have retained. In 1465, near the end of his life, the Archbishop of Mainz awarded him a position at court, an honorary pension that came with a salary and an exemption from certain taxes. It was, perhaps, recognition of what he had achieved. He died in 1468. He died without having published a single book under his own name. He died having received almost no public recognition for what he had built. He died, as far as we can tell, in relatively modest circumstances, while the technology he had developed was already spreading across Europe. By the time of his death, there were printing presses in Cologne, Strasbourg, Basel, Augsburg, Rome. Within 20 years of the Gutenberg Bible, printing had reached every major city in Europe. Within 50 years, there were printing presses in every country on the continent and in the Americas. Gutenberg saw none of this. The man who made the modern world did not live to see it. The spread of printing across Europe in the second half of the 15th century was not gradual. It was, by the standards of any previous information technology, explosive. In 1450, there were no printing presses in Europe. By 1500, 50 years later, there were an estimated 250 printing offices operating in roughly 70 European cities. They had collectively produced somewhere between 8 and 20 million books. Think about what that means. In the entire history of European writing, up to 1450, all the manuscripts ever produced, by every monk in every scriptorium across 1,000 years of Christianity, numbered in the tens of thousands. In 50 years of printing, the number of books in Europe grew by a factor of hundreds. The price of books collapsed. A book that had cost as much as a farm in 1400 could be purchased for less than a week's wages by 1480. Literacy rates began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, as the existence of affordable books created both the incentive to learn to read and the material to practice on. But it was not just books. The printing press produced something that had never existed before: the pamphlet, the broadsheet, the newsletter. Short, cheap, quickly printed, widely distributed texts that could spread an idea across an entire country within weeks. Information was no longer controlled by those who controlled the manuscripts. Information could now move faster than authority could respond to it. And the first authority to discover what this meant was the one that had depended most completely on controlling information: the Church. On the 31st of October 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed, or possibly posted, or had delivered, a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The document was titled Disputatio pro declaratione virtutis indulgentiarum. In English, Disputation on the Power of Indulgences. It contained 95 theses, 95 arguments against the Catholic practice of selling indulgences, payments made to the Church in exchange for the remission of sins. This was not, in itself, an unprecedented act. Theological debate was a normal part of academic life. Scholars had criticized church practices before. The Church had survived such criticisms for centuries. What Luther was doing was, in form, conventional. What was different was what happened next. Within 2 weeks of Luther's document appearing in Wittenberg, it had been reprinted and distributed across Germany. Within 2 months, it had spread to France, England, and Italy. Within a year, Luther's ideas, his specific arguments in his specific words, had reached virtually every literate person in Europe. The printing press had done this. Luther himself understood what had happened. He later wrote, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." He was not speaking metaphorically. He had watched his ideas travel without distortion, without mediation, without the filtering that the Church's control of manuscripts had always allowed. His words had reached people directly. He had expected, at most, a local academic debate. He got the Protestant Reformation. The Church's response was to try to suppress the printed word, to establish censorship, to create lists of prohibited books, to burn heretical texts. It was a reasonable instinct. It was also completely futile. There were too many presses, in too many cities, in too many countries. The Pope could order a book destroyed in Rome. It would be reprinted in Strasbourg within a month. The information monopoly was broken. It could not be reassembled. The Western world would never be the same. The story of the printing press and the Reformation is the story most people know, and it is largely true. But it is only one part of what the press did, and it tends to overshadow everything else. The printing press also printed science. In 1543, 2 books were published that between them fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of the physical world. The first was De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium by Nicolaus Copernicus, the book that placed the sun, not the earth, at the center of the solar system. The second was De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius, a detailed anatomical study of the human body based on actual dissections with illustrations of unprecedented precision. Both books were made possible by printing, not just in the sense that printing distributed them, though it did, and rapidly, but in the sense that the precision of printed illustrations allowed for the first time an anatomical drawing or an astronomical diagram to be reproduced identically in hundreds of copies. A hand-copied illustration was always slightly different from the original. A printed illustration was always identical. This reproducibility was transformative for science. Observations could now be shared exactly. Diagrams of experiments could be reproduced without distortion. Scientists in different cities could look at the same image and debate the same data. The printing press did not cause the scientific revolution, but it made the scientific revolution possible in the form it took: international, cumulative, building on shared precise knowledge rather than on imprecise oral transmission. The press also printed law. Standardized legal codes, identical in every copy, meant that the same law could apply in the same words across an entire country. The development of national legal systems, and eventually of constitutions, depended on printing.
It printed maps.
It printed musical notation. It printed vernacular languages: German, French, English, Italian, and in doing so, helped standardize and stabilize those languages into the forms we recognize today. It printed lies, propaganda, and rumors too. It printed accusations against minorities that led to pogroms. It printed astrological charts that had no basis in reality. It printed sensationalized accounts of crimes and disasters that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. The press was not a tool of truth. It was a tool of multiplication. Whatever you put into it came out in thousands of copies, true or false, wise or dangerous, sacred or vile. The same technology that spread Luther's theology spread the blood libel. The same press that printed the works of Erasmus printed the pamphlets that called for the burning of Jews. This too is part of the story. Here is something the history of printing rarely emphasizes. The printing press saved languages. In the centuries before printing, the written language of Europe was Latin. Not because people spoke Latin. By 1400, no one spoke Latin as a mother tongue, but because writing was a specialized activity performed by specialists who had been trained in Latin. The vernacular languages, the languages people actually spoke in their homes and markets and churches, existed in writing only in scattered, inconsistent, regional forms. German was not one language. It was dozens of mutually intelligible but orthographically chaotic dialects. English was barely recognizable to a speaker traveling 50 miles from their home. French existed in forms so different that a Parisian and a Provençal speaker might struggle to communicate. Printing changed this because printers needed to reach the largest possible audience. A printer in Leipzig needed customers not just in Leipzig, but in Frankfurt, in Hamburg, in Vienna. The economic incentive to standardize was powerful. Printers, and the writers who worked with them, began making decisions about spelling, about grammar, about vocabulary that gradually converged the wild variety of spoken dialects into something more stable, more consistent, more recognizable as a language. Martin Luther's German Bible, his 1534 translation of the Scriptures, is often credited with establishing the foundation of modern Standard German. Not because Luther invented the language, but because his Bible was printed and distributed so widely that its spelling and vocabulary became a de facto standard that others imitated. William Tyndale's English Bible translation, and later the King James Version of 1611, did the same for English. The phrases they coined, the salt of the earth, a law unto themselves, the skin of my teeth, my brother's keeper, entered the English language through print and have never left. The printing press did not just distribute languages. In a real sense, it created them. The question of when and how printing technology moved between Asia and Europe is one that historians have debated for decades without reaching a final answer. What is known is this. By the time Gutenberg was developing his press in the 1440s, he had almost certainly never seen a Chinese or Korean printed book. The Silk Road trade routes existed, but the transmission of specific technical knowledge along them was inconsistent. There is no document, no letter, no account that records Gutenberg or any European contemporary receiving information about East Asian printing. What is also known is that block printing, printing from carved wooden blocks, had reached Europe from Asia by the late 13th or early 14th century. Playing cards and textiles printed from blocks were being produced in Europe well before Gutenberg. The concept of using a carved surface to transfer ink to paper was not unknown in Europe. What Gutenberg developed was the specific system of individually cast, reusable, alphabetic type, a development that built on the general concept of printing but solved the problems that made it practical for the Latin alphabet. Whether the idea of movable type itself traveled from Asia to Europe, inspiring Gutenberg's work without his knowing its origin, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be said is that the problem Gutenberg solved, how to print efficiently using a small number of reusable characters, was a different problem from the one Chinese and Korean printers faced with their thousands of characters writing systems. Gutenberg's solution was specifically suited to the European alphabetic context. The printing press reached Asia in a different direction in the 16th century, when Jesuit missionaries brought European printing technology to Japan and China, technologies that in principle had originated in those same regions, transformed by European adaptation and returned in a different form. The history of the printing press, in other words, is not a story of European discovery, but of global exchange. Ideas moving along trade routes and missionary networks being adapted, transformed, and transmitted in forms their originators would not have recognized.
Every authority that has ever existed
Has, at some point, tried to control the press. Within decades of Gutenberg's first Bible, the Catholic Church had established systems of prior censorship, requiring books to be approved before printing. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of books Catholics were forbidden to read, was established in 1559 and remained in official existence until 1966. Secular governments were equally attentive. In England, printing was licensed by the Crown, and unlicensed presses were illegal. The Licensing Act of 1662 required official approval for any publication. When the Act lapsed in 1695, not for any principled reason but simply because Parliament failed to renew it, the practical freedom of the English press was established almost by accident. In France, royal censorship was tight throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And yet, the books that censorship most wanted to suppress, the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, the Encyclopédie, were printed in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in any jurisdiction beyond the reach of French authority, and smuggled across borders in quantities that made censorship effectively impossible. The pattern repeated everywhere, in every era. Authority tries to control what is printed. Printing finds a way around authority. The technology is too distributed, too portable, too simple to operate to be fully suppressed.
This is not just historical observation.
It describes something fundamental about the nature of printing, and by extension, about every subsequent information technology that printing eventually gave rise to. The photocopier, the personal computer, the internet. Each one has been subjected to attempts at control. Each one has, to varying degrees, resisted those attempts by being inherently distributed in ways that make central control difficult. The printing press established a pattern that has never been broken. Let me try to account for what Johannes Gutenberg actually started. Not what he intended. There is no evidence he intended anything beyond a profitable business. He was a craftsman and an entrepreneur, not a revolutionary. He wanted to sell Bibles. What he started, without intending to, was something that has not yet ended. The printing press broke the information monopoly of the Church and made the Protestant Reformation possible. It enabled the standardization of languages and the development of national literatures. It made the scientific revolution communicable across borders. It gave the Enlightenment philosophers a means of reaching audiences that no previous philosopher had ever commanded. It made books affordable enough that literacy became economically rational for ordinary people. And as literacy spread, it created pressure for education, for schools, for universities, for libraries. The democratization of literacy was not instantaneous. It took centuries, but it began with printing. It also created the newspaper. The first regular printed newspapers appeared in Germany and the Netherlands in the early 17th century. By the 18th century, newspapers were the primary medium of political debate in Europe and the American colonies. The American Revolution was argued in print, in pamphlets and newspapers, and the published correspondence of its leaders in a way that would not have been possible without printing. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, 6 months before the Declaration of Independence, sold an estimated 500,000 copies in a country of 2.5 million people. The printing press did not cause the American Revolution, but common sense helped make it happen, and common sense was printing. Everything that followed, the newspaper, the novel, the academic journal, the political pamphlet, the advertising broadsheet, the magazine, the catalogue, the legal code, the scientific paper. Everything we have come to think of as the infrastructure of modern civilization. All of it runs, at its root, through Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz.
In the spring of 1455,
A diplomat named Enea Silvio Piccolomini, later to become Pope Pius II, wrote a letter from Frankfurt describing something he had seen. He had seen sheets of printed Bible text being shown to prospective buyers. The type was so clear, he wrote, that one could read it without glasses, without effort. He had not been able to get a complete copy. They were already spoken for, already sold, before they were bound. He was writing to tell his correspondent that this technology was real and that it was extraordinary. He had no idea what he was describing. He was describing the end of the medieval world. He was describing the beginning of the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the age of newspapers, the age of the novel, the age of popular literacy. He was describing the moment when knowledge stopped being a possession of the few and began to become, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous resistance and enormous consequences, a right of the many. Gutenberg never received that letter. He died without knowing that Piccolomini would become Pope. He died without knowing that Luther would shake the Church with a printed document. He died without knowing that the technology he had built would outlast every empire, every censorship, every attempt at control for the next 600 years.
he just built the machine.
He just wanted to sell Bibles. But the word, once printed, would not stay still. It moved. It spread. It crossed borders and centuries and languages. It found its way into hands that were not supposed to have it. It became the thing that could not be unwritten, unsaid, unthought. It became the world we live in. And behind it, behind every book you have ever read, every newspaper, every page, every screen, there is a goldsmith in Mainz, adjusting the fit of a metal letter in a wooden frame, holding it up to the light, checking whether it sits true. It does. He sets it in place. He builds the line.